When you read the Bible, you'll notice that the Bible makes a very clear distinction between us and God. God is our creator. We are His creation. He is superior and we are inferior. In a variety of ways, that truth is demonstrated over and over again from Genesis to Revelation. The difference between God and us is especially noticed in how we deal with sin. There's a very different way that God deals with sin from how we attempt to deal with sin. For example, in Isaiah chapter 55 in verses 6 through 9, the prophet wrote, "Seek the Lord while He may be found. Call upon Him while He is near. Let the wicked forsake his way and the righteous man his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord that He may have compassion on him, and to our God, for He will abundantly pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." This text sets forth that there's one of two ways that we can deal with sin. We can deal with sin our way, or we can deal with it God's way. And of course, there in Isaiah, the prophet is petitioning Israel to seek God's way to deal with their sin. So this morning we're going to do that. We're going to look at these two ways. We're going to talk about our way of dealing with sin and contrast it by the way in which God seeks to deal with our sin. So if we think about our way, how do we deal with sin? If we went around the room, I suppose there's any number of answers that might be given about how we try to deal with our sin, the guilt of our sin, the shame of our sin, how to repair and to amend and compensate for our sin. There's all kinds of things that we might do. If we go to the Bible, you don't have to look very far. You don't have to go to look very far in the Bible to find out how we as human beings vainly attempt to deal with our sin. If we go to Genesis chapter 3, we find where Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, living in harmony with God and with one another, in this paradise that God has made for them, they sin. They transgress God's law. They disobey. And everything changes. Life in the world changes very drastically. But in that chapter, among other things, you find the way that Adam and Eve responded to their sin, how they attempted to deal with it. There's three things that they did. They hid, they blamed, and they tried to cover themselves. They hid, they blamed, and they tried to cover themselves. There's a tremendous amount that we can learn from the opening chapters of Genesis about ourselves as human beings. The things that are very basic and fundamental to our existence that are critical that we learn and take away from those opening chapters of Genesis. I would suggest to you this morning that how we attempt to deal with sin can be seen in Genesis chapter 3. And while there might be a lot of different steps we would take, a lot of different actions, that whatever we might do as human beings to try to deal with our sin, I would suggest would fit into one of those three categories: of hiding, blaming, and trying to cover ourselves. So let's talk about these three things as we would try to deal with sin our way. Let's talk about hiding. Adam and Eve hid. And in that hiding says something about their recognition of sin. Everyone, ladies and gentlemen, recognizes their sin. Everyone. We cannot, as people, help but recognize our sin. That explains our behavior. We're shocked by it. We're broken by it. We respond to it. When Adam and Eve sinned, they didn't just continue on living. Everything changed. They could not help but react to what they did. Their hiding stems from a newfound sense of shame, a newfound sense of guilt. And because of that, they hide. They never had any reason to respond to anything like this before because, well, they hadn't sinned. And so when there was no sin, there was no guilt, there was no shame, there was no sense of embarrassment. But they tried to hide. Now you can look at Genesis and think, well, what does it mean that they tried to hide? Were they hiding under a bush somewhere? And do we hide from God in the same way? In the same way, but perhaps slightly different, the way we would go about hiding, trying to hide from God. What do we try to accomplish when we hide from God? We want to hide from Him to keep Him out of reach, to stay out of sight. We want God out of our lives, away from any ramifications for our decisions to go our own way. One of the ways that we try to hide from God is by suppressing Him. We try to suppress Him. There are things that we do, there are barriers that we try to create to keep Him out of our reach and out of our sight. In Romans chapter 1 and verses 18 and 19, Paul says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them." Now there is some connection between what Paul describes in Romans 1 to what happened in Genesis 3 to what goes on continually in our lives in our world today. Did Adam and Eve know God? Was God plain to them? Perhaps He was plainer to them then than He is now. They dwelt together in perfect harmony, the likes of which the world has not known since. Well, a lot had changed since the Garden of Eden to the Gentiles of Paul's day. A lot has changed since the Gentiles of Paul's day to our day, but we've continued to sin, and despite that, God has continued to reveal Himself. The reality of God, the truth of God, is unavoidable. It's inescapable. Despite what we would try to do to suppress Him, to keep Him out of sight, to keep Him out of reach. Do you recognize the tension that's going on here in Romans 1? The tension that existed with God and Adam and Eve, the tension that goes on in our lives when we try to hide from Him? Here, we're pushing Him away, but He's pushing toward us. There's tension. Despite all that we do, God continues to try to show up in our lives. A lot of things that we might try to do to suppress Him, to hide from Him. We might use our science and our technology to hide from God. Maybe some of you have heard of the theory of the God of the gaps. You heard of God of the gaps? There's something out here in the world that we don't understand, that we can't explain. So what's the explanation that we give to this unknown phenomenon? Well, God. But the more we learn and discover through science and technology, well, we can give an explanation to what was previously unknown, and now God just gets smaller and smaller and smaller in our lives. God of the gaps. Well, that's one approach. We might try to suppress Him by our money. We're not dependent on Him because, well, we can take care of ourselves. We can make our own way in the world. Maybe we try to hide and suppress Him through entertainment. Life is just about, one big party. And we want to keep the party going. We want to keep the music playing because we don't want to have a quiet moment where we are forced to contemplate our purpose. We don't want to have a sober moment to think about things that really matter. We want to avoid it at all costs. But eventually, the party stops, the music goes quiet, and we're made to confront the darker sides of life. Adam and Eve could not hide. Eventually, God comes to the garden and He calls out to Adam, "Where are you?" As if God didn't already know. But He called out to Adam, and immediately Adam responds. He could not stay silent. That says something about our efforts to hide, doesn't it? There's coming a day when God's going to call out to all of us and hold us all accountable just as He did Adam and Eve. Our efforts to hide are going to be proven worthless, futile, and our sin is going to be exposed. Well, what about blaming others? This is a very basic and common response to our sin. Whose fault is it? Well, it's not mine. It's not my fault. I am not to blame. It's someone else. Adam says, well, it's the woman that you gave me. That woman had a name, you know. He doesn't even use her name. It was the woman that you gave. God, it's your. If you wouldn't have given her to me, then immediately this response to his sin is to hide and then to start blaming. And then Eve, you know, that was the serpent. It was the serpent. Now, there was some truth in that. There was some truth in what Adam said, wasn't there? There was some truth in what Eve said. That's kind of how blame works, isn't it? Oh, there's some truth in it. But the truth does not negate our responsibility for our actions. So yes, the serpent did entice Eve. But Eve chose to eat. And yes, Eve did entice Adam, but he chose to eat. And so God's response is eventually going to be, He's going to hold all three of them accountable. He's going to hold all three accountable. We have a habit. It's like here we're on the World Series. It was last night, our national pastime. One of our national pastime is blaming people. We've gotten very good at it, especially in the last couple of years as we've gone through some very difficult times in our lives, in our country, in our world. Don't you get tired of all of the blame? What's the problem? Where do I focus blame for my sin? What's in my family? Let me guess, your mother? The blame for every man in this world is his mother, right? And every woman in this world, all of the reason why she is the way she is because of her father. Start sounding like a psychologist. It was the way I was brought up. Well, there's some truth to that, though, isn't there? Your mother and father have an influence on you. Our family and upbringings are formative. But eventually we come to a point in life where we have to make a decision about ourselves. We've got to decide, what am I going to do with my life? We blame the schools for the problems that our children have. We blame the government. My, oh my, how we blame the government. It's the government's fault. It's the Republicans' fault. It's the Democrats' fault. I mean, think of the irony of how we blame government. We have politicians who run for office blaming government, but they're the ones who want to run government. It's staggering. It's the government's fault why we are the way we are. The schools fault. Have a little sympathy for your school board. My, oh my. Oh, it's the church's fault. You ever blame the church? You blame our unfaithfulness on the church? blame it on the preacher. We blame the elders. We blame the unkind word that was said to us by someone 50 years ago. Again, there comes a point in time where we have to own up and take responsibility for our own actions, and that's demonstrated in Genesis chapter 3. Blaming is a fruitless endeavor. Years after the garden in Ezekiel chapter 18, you have this generational issue. The whole generation blaming their parents. Why are we the way we are? Well, it's our parents. Fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. Every generation could say that. As I live, declares the Lord, this proverb shall no more be used in Israel. God's saying enough is enough. Stop it with the blame. Behold, all souls are mine. The soul of the Father is, as well as the soul of the Son is mine. The soul who sins shall die. Again, when we blame, there's some truth to it. Are there problems in the family? Yeah. Problems in the government, problems with the schools, problems with the church? Yeah. All of those groups, relationships are run by people. And as long as people are involved, there's going to be problems. There's going to be sin. And we're going to have to deal with it. How are you going to deal with it? By just placing blame? God says, no, I hold people accountable for their own actions. And then thirdly, well, they hid, they blamed, then they tried to cover themselves. When Adam and Eve experienced shame, they tried to make clothing that was adequate to cover their nakedness, to compensate for their sin, their shame. But their effort and their product was inadequate. It was inadequate. How do we cover ourselves? So they tried to make clothing for themselves to cover the shame of their nakedness. Their covering was inadequate. How do we cover ourselves? How would we try to cover ourselves? Well, maybe we rationalize our sin. There's a good reason for it. Maybe we rely on others' godliness. My grandpa, he'll cover for me. My grandpa, he was a faithful Christian. He was an elder in the church. He'll cover for me. Is that how it works? Maybe we try to compensate for our sin with good works. Well, we know that we've got sin. We're ashamed. We're overcome and crushed by guilt and by fear. Well, what are we going to do about it? We're going to straighten up. We're going to be good. Everything Adam and Eve tried to do, everything they tried to do in response to their sin was at the very limit of their understanding. They did everything they thought they could do to deal with their sin. Tried to hide, tried to blame, tried to cover themselves. None of it was good enough. None of it worked. None of it worked. What about us? I mean, do you want to deal with sin this way? You want to hide? You want to blame someone? You want to try to cover yourself? That's what we try to do. None of it works. There's got to be a better way. After all, Isaiah says that God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts. There's a better way. Through Him and what He's done, what He provides, to deal with our sin, to forgive it, to transform and renew us. Well, what's God's way? How does God deal with our sin? Well, in a word, it's grace. In a word, God deals with our sin by grace. And while the word is not used in Genesis 3, it is all over the place. God comes into the garden and He asks some questions. He holds Adam and Eve and the serpent accountable. He tells them the consequences of their actions, what they're going to be. Then He rescues them. He rescues them. Now sometimes we focus on the consequences of their actions and we don't see the rescue, but He rescued them. He takes them out of the garden. Why did He do that? Why did He take them out of the garden? He says, well, in this fallen state, if they eat of the tree of life, they're going to live forever in a fallen condition. God rescues them. Not only that, in some of the consequences that He pronounces to the devil, as he illustrates how this rescue is going to be fulfilled in the future. Through the seed of woman, the devil is going to be defeated and man is going to be redeemed. Many years later, the Apostle Paul in Ephesians chapter 2, he would write, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not of your own doing. It's the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no man may boast." You're not going to be saved by hiding. You're not going to be saved by blaming someone else. You're not even going to be saved by trying to cover yourself with good works. The only hope that any of us have for salvation is by God's grace that is culminated in the seed of woman, Jesus Christ, at the cross. And unless and until you are overwhelmed by the grace of God, you won't be saved. It has got to be overwhelming. Paul was overwhelmed by the grace of God. Overwhelmed by the grace of God. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, when he writes about it as personally as he can, he says, here's what I was. He was a sinner who was trying to cover himself through good works. And he thought that was enough. See, what happens if you think that you can be saved by being good, one of two things is going to happen. Either you're going to be like Paul, you're going to become self-righteous. I'm a good person. I deserve to be saved. I'm entitled. I'm better than other people. If you think you can be saved by works, you either become self-righteous, or on the other hand, you're going to be crushed. You're going to be crushed by the shame and the guilt and the fear of your sin, because what you'll realize is that none of your good is going to compensate for your sin. And there are people like that. There are people like that in the world who are overrun, overcome by the shame, guilt, and fear of their sin. Realizing there's nothing they can do to save themselves. There's got to be a better way. The better way is God's way. The better way is the way of grace. The way that asks us to trust, to believe, and to trust in what God has done for us through Jesus. And if you can believe that, if you can trust that, begin to rely on that, your life is going to be changed. Your life is going to be transformed. It is going to be humbling. Realizing, hey, I can't do this on my own. If it wasn't for what God has accomplished in Jesus, I'm hopeless. Faith is what's going to make the difference in your life. faith in the grace of God. So the sin that you had committed, you're going to turn away from it. Someone who's broken, someone who's poor in spirit, who is grieving, they're recognizing what sin's good for, that it's good for nothing. And they want a better way. They want someone to come along and lift them up, to forgive them, to heal them, to soothe their guilt, to calm their fear. That's what grace does. As we have sung for generations, grace relieves all of that. Question for us is, well, which way will you take? I mean, in life is very much a crossroads. You can choose to do it your way, and we've talked about what that looks like and the consequence of it. Or you can choose God's way, the way of grace. The way of grace is a way of salvation. If you're here this morning and you'd like to choose God's way, we'd encourage you to do that. Stop looking to yourself and looking to Him to save you, to show you how to have a better life, a life of renewal, a life of hope of being reunited with Him unendingly. If you'd like to begin that path, the way of grace today, expressing your faith in the cross of Christ, by being baptized, you can receive the forgiveness and renewal that He affords. If we can help you be saved today, please come forward right now as together we stand and sing.